I realize the food is a little bit late, so if you need to quietly go and get some coffee and please do so. Welcome back. There's Michelle. Audrey, so welcome back to those that have participated in our inaugural series in the spring. If you missed it and you want to catch them, we do videotape them and they are posted and available for anyone to view. I'm really pleased that the enthusiastic response to the first series has led to the fall series, and I'm really pleased to see we've got pretty much a full house here. We'll have to face with the interesting problem of finding bigger space if we have to, so that's a good problem. My name is Bill Goff, and I'm the Vice Principal Academic and Dean at UTSC. And I'm really excited and pleased to be introducing our first speaker for the fall series of Great Explorations. Today's speaker is Professor Donna Gabaccia. She's a professor of history in our Historical and Cultural Studies Department at UTSC, and also associated with the Tri-Campus Graduate Department of History at the University of Toronto. In the past, she's been a director of the Immigration History Research Center at the University of Minnesota. She has also served, in the year that I served as interim dean, she was interim chair of Historical and Cultural Studies, and it was an absolute pleasure to work with her. She understands the university, but she also advocates very effectively for her own group. That's what I like to share. She's an author of an incredible number of books, 14 books, have I read that? Is that true?
Yeah. Some of them are edited volumes.
Okay, well that's still a lot of work. And dozens of articles and on immigrant class, gender, and food studies in the United States, on Italian migration around the world, and migration in world history. And she has the lived experience of being an immigrant, so I'm sure that will be woven into her talk today. In 2015, her book, Gender and International Migration, co-authored with sociologist and demographer Catherine Donato, was awarded honorable mention from the American Sociological Association's
Janetsky.
Okay, prize. Her work in public history earned her the 2013 University of Minnesota Outstanding Community Service Award for faculty and the 2012 Society of American Archivists Hamer Tagan Award for Immigration History Research Center project called Digitizing Immigrant Letters. So we truly have an expert here to speak to us today on these issues. She teaches undergraduate and graduate courses in history, women's studies, and food studies, focusing on migration, gender, and diaspora, in-world history, digital history, and gender in the kitchen. Her topic today is Where Are the Nations of Immigrants? And Historians Talks to the 21st Century. So I'm very pleased to welcome Professor Donna Gabaccia.
Good morning. Welcome back to UTSC. Obviously, I want to thank Dean Bill Goff for simply organizing this series of lectures. The purpose of these lectures is in part to highlight the knowledge and expertise of UTSC scholars and faculty members like myself, but even more, it's to bring that expertise out into communities and to foster very public discussions. Today, of course, we're going to be focusing on an issue that's vitally important in today's world, and that's the issue of migration. And as an historian, I'll be talking today about the popular concept of the nation of immigrants, but thinking about it in a new way by making it plural. The nations of immigrants. What has that term meant historically? What does it mean today? And what is its future in an increasingly, or at least very mobile world? Now, oddly enough, this is a discussion and a question that I've already posed in public presentations in many other countries, including Germany, Austria, and France and Australia. But I've never actually talked about it with a community audience in Canada. So I'm particularly excited to see what kinds of questions and reservations and responses that are going to emerge here in Toronto this morning. Now, I scarcely need to tell you that for quite some time, the United States has represented itself as the model or the paradigmatic nation of immigrants, nor do I need to remind you that right now, in that very nation of immigrants to our south, very passionate, very ugly, very divisive debates have broken out between those who embrace the idea of the United States as a nation of immigrants and those who increasingly believe the US would be a better place if it closed its door, reduced the numbers who enter as workers, immigrants, and refugees. And on this slide, I've just chosen a few random images to represent the passionate feeling behind those debates on some of the slogans that are being used in those debates. Now, as a citizen, still a citizen of the United States, I will confess up front, I too possess rather passionate feelings about these debates. My family history is nothing if it's not a history of migration and of mobility. I have also studied international migration for almost 50 years. This is not just an academic matter for me. I have personally been an immigrant and a temporary labor migrant in Germany and in Switzerland and now in Canada. And here in Canada, it, as Bill knows, took me 3 long years to accumulate sufficient points to be granted just 2 months ago permanent residency. Finally, as an historian, as Bill mentions, I don't actually teach a course called Canadian Immigration History or American Immigration History. I teach courses with titles like Migration and Global History, or The History of Human Mobility, or Comparing Nations of Immigrants. And that means that I want to bring this morning a kind of global perspective into our discussion of that deceptive question, where are the nation of immigrants? So the United States is not the only country in the world that has a long history of receiving migrants from around the world. It is not even the only country in the world with a sizable migrant population. But in a world of over 200 countries, it is one of a very small group that calls itself a nation of immigrants. In today's world, 3.5% of the population globally lives outside of the countries where they were born. So for me, this poses kind of an interesting moment in human history. As migrations have increased in recent years, does that mean there may be in the 21st century more nations of immigrants than there are today? And that's the second question that I want to explore with you this morning. Now, for both Americans in the US and for many people around the world, the US is absolutely and without question the paradigmatic nation of immigrants among those 200 countries of the world. It's the exemplar, it's the symbol of how immigration can build a nation. The US is also, I think, globally the country that is most associated with immigration, largely because it celebrates its American dream, as it's called, a dream that Americans believe at least motivates people to travel to the US to achieve economic mobility or personal freedom, to find safety and security. But actually, as an historian of global migrations, I know that the United States isn't completely alone in featuring dreams of security, economic mobility, safety, and personal freedom. And in fact, it's one of a very small cluster of nations, which are listed here on the slide, that also call themselves nations of immigrants, or sometimes they prefer nations of immigration. But it's a small group. Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, along with the United States, on occasion call themselves nations of immigrants. And if you go Googling around on the internet or looking in university library catalogs, you will find books about Canada which call Canada a nation of immigrants. Sometimes, although less often, France, Argentina, and Israel also call themselves nations of immigrants, although especially in France and in Argentina, the preferred national label is nations of immigration, where a long history of human mobility is acknowledged. So what is it, actually, that unites the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand as nations of immigrants? What is it that leads them to call themselves nations of immigrants? First, all of these countries began as settler colonies within the British Empire, right? Second, all of them developed through the conquest of indigenous peoples who were already living there when the Europeans arrived. Third, all of these countries recruited or otherwise enticed immigrants with a number of very concrete promises. And one of those is the promise of what in the United States is called birthright citizenship, but which any Canadian knows about, since anyone born on Canadian soil is by birth and by birthright a citizen of Canada. And that's something Canada shares with both Australia and the United States and New Zealand. We could also argue that Israel, in a sense, is a product of the British Empire, although that's a complicated story. Certainly, Argentina began as a settler colony within Spain's early modern empire, and it too, Argentina and Israel, offer birthright citizenship to the children of immigrants. Argentina and France also share a fourth trait of these nations of immigrants and nations of immigration. All the countries that you see listed here offer immigrants an opportunity to change their political allegiances and to become citizens through a process which is usually called, or at least scholars call, naturalization, right? Israel's claim to being a nation of immigrants is a little tenuous on this point, since it prefers to give open naturalization only to Jewish immigrants acquiring Israeli citizenship. So here are the characteristics of the nations of immigrants as I, please, don't worry, as I understand them. They're former settler colonies. They developed through the conquest of indigenous people. They offer immigrants birthright citizenship for any children they have, and they open up options for you to change your political allegiances from one citizenship to another, or in many cases now to maintain both. Having identified some of those characteristics of nations of immigrants, we can now ask whether or not this very small circle of nations worldwide is going to expand in the 21st century in response to the upsurges of global migration that have occurred in the past 50 years or so. Let's begin simply by thinking about where the 240 million plus migrants of today's world live. We live in an age of migration. Where do those migrants live in today's world? Well, first of all, a quarter of them live in just 3 of the nations of immigrants I've already named. They live in the very large country of the United States, which attracts about 1/5 of all migrants globally. And they also live in the 2 smaller nations of immigrants, Canada and Australia, which together attract about 6% of the world's migrants today. Another 20% of today's migrants globally live in what I call pre-Brexit Europe, right, including in the UK. So that's over half of the world's migrants or almost half of the world's migrants right there. They live and they've migrated to some of the richest countries in the world, and I bet that's not going to surprise any of you to learn that. But here come the surprises. Another 16% of the migrants of today's world live in a few relatively poorer countries such as Russia, Brazil, and China. And the final 15% live in actually very tiny but extremely wealthy countries such as Switzerland, Singapore, and the United Arab Emirates. In short, if we want to go looking for these possible 21st century nations of immigrants, we have a lot of territory to cover. And we also face a statistical challenge. Should we be comparing the absolute numbers of migrants, as I just did, who live in various countries around the world, whether they live in a big country or a teeny country like Singapore or Switzerland? Or should we instead be focusing on the demographic impact of those migrations, usually expressed as a percentage of the resident population of each country? Now, in this slide, I've tried to give you both measures. This table that you see here focuses exclusively on countries with more than 3 million residents. It's true that every small country in the world today has relatively high proportions of immigrants, but they're minuscule in numbers. Second, this table includes only those 3 million plus population countries that are well above the global average of 3.5% migrant, right? So here's the size of the country, and here in this, we're looking at countries that are more 14% migrants or higher. We start here at the bottom at 14% in Croatia, and we end up at the top, 88% migrant in the United Arab Emirates. Now, this table that you're viewing uses a measure of demographic impact, which was invented by the United Nations, and which is called living outside the country of birth. Probably in Canada or in the US, we would call these people foreign-born. For a variety of reasons, the United Nations has invented this lovely acronym. LOCBs is what I'm going to call them. It's really awkward, but as you're going to see, terminology matters. This is what the UN uses, this is what the World Bank uses to compare countries and the impact of migration across borders. Now, as you're about to see, LOCBs include many people who we might not call immigrants. So to understand the LOCBs and the possibility that they will become parts of nations of immigrants in the future, I've decided to look briefly at 4 of the countries with the question marks here that I've circled on the left. And then I'm going to add a 5th country, which can't be ignored in any discussion of global migration for reasons I'll explain in a minute. But I'm going to look, first of all, at Jordan, Kazakhstan, the UAE, and Switzerland, all of whom have higher proportions of migrants in their populations than does the United States, that paradigmatic nation of immigrants. So, Jordan. I rather doubt that anyone in this room expects Jordan will become a nation of immigrants in the 21st century, despite the fact that 40% of its population are LOCBs. Jordan is located in a region in Western Asia, we usually call it the Middle East, which has historically been a very mobile place. It's been occupied historically by nomadic pastoralists and merchant traders around the Mediterranean and the Red Sea. But the images of this screen tell you almost everything you need to know about Jordan's current LOCB population. Most of the LOCBs in Jordan are refugees. And they live, as this image on the right suggests, in long existing refugee camps. Beginning with the formation of Israel in 1947, more than 2 million registered Palestinian refugees fled to Jordan. And about 370,000 of them still live in the 10 refugee camps organized by the UN in the 40s and 50s. Some of them have, in fact, acquired Jordanian citizenship through a process of naturalization. But almost equal numbers have seen Jordan take away their citizenship for reasons that I hope will be apparent to you in 1 second. Jordan does not offer birthright citizenship, so refugees' children and grandchildren must also make a decision, will I seek Jordanian citizenship or not? Jordan has required anyone seeking Jordanian citizenship to give up their original nationality, and many Palestinian refugees have said, no, I'm still a Palestinian and I'm not giving up that identification in order to become a citizen of Jordan. Now, as of December 2016, more recently, the numbers of refugees in Jordan have again skyrocketed, largely because over 650,000 Syrian refugees arrived and were placed in newer camps like the one you see here. This is Zaatari, depicted in the image on the left. So, will those newer refugees seek to remain permanently in Jordan? Will they seek to obtain Jordanian citizenship? At present, at least, most of them would probably prefer to remain or return to a peaceful Syria, and that's a preference that's shared by refugees worldwide, at least during the first years of their exile. Public opinion polls of Jordanians are very clear. They want them to go back to Syria. I'm an historian. I can't predict what will happen in the future, but at least if we look at the Palestinian refugees of 50 years ago and the adaptation of their lives over time, it seems unlikely that Jordan is going to become a nation of immigrants any time soon. Let me point to a somewhat different case and ask, well, is Kazakhstan going to become a nation of immigrants? For those of you who don't know, this is Kazakhstan, a very large and relatively new country in Central Asia. Its population, 20% LOCBs. In other words, just a little bit lower than Canada's. Kazakhstan, like Jordan, celebrates a very long history of mobility, largely because its indigenous peoples, the Kazakhs, shown here in their national costumes, were also nomadic pastoralists. They were herders who took their flocks on yearly kind of rounds through the countryside to feed them. However, in the 19th century, Kazakhstan was colonized by the expanding Russian Empire. And in order to encourage agriculture, Russia also encouraged settlers to travel from places like Germany, Ukraine, and elsewhere in Russia itself to Kazakhstan to become farmers and thereby to kind of push the indigenous and migratory pastoralists to the edges of Kazakh economy. The pie chart here on the right shows you the consequences. There it is. The consequences of those 19th century migrations. In 1989, when the Soviet Union collapsed, Soviet Kazakhstan disappeared, and a new nation was formed. And at that moment, the new nation decided Kazakhstan is for Kazakhs. And the descendants who had inherited their nationality from Russia or Germany or the Soviet Empire became foreigners. So the 20% LOCBs in Kazakhstan today never moved anywhere. They've been living there as the descendants of Russians, Ukrainians, and Germans, usually for at least 4 or 5 generations. As theorists like to say, the LOCBs of Kazakhstan never crossed a border. The border crossed them. And that, too, is probably not a solid foundation for Kazakhstan imagining itself in the future as a nation of immigrants, since it has essentially taken the former settlers and immigrants from elsewhere and said, sorry, you're not a citizen of Kazakhstan. Now, when we turn to the United Arab Emirates, we look at the country in the world that today has the highest proportion of LOCBs in the world. As a rich, oil-rich country, the UAE and its LOCBs are much more typical of the rest of the world than is Kazakhstan or Jordan. The UAE does grant citizenship to people born on its territories, and it does have procedures for naturalization. But especially its procedures for naturalization are so vague that almost no one in the UAE ever claims Emirati citizenship. And in large part, that's because the LOCBs in the United Arab Emirates never remain long enough and are separated from their families in ways that make it impossible for them to have birthright children, and almost impossible for them to contemplate naturalization. The UAE has wanted, and it has recruited, thousands upon hundreds of thousands of temporary workers. They are men, largely from South Asia and the Philippines, who work in construction or in the oil industry. They are women, again, largely from the Philippines, who work in domestic service. These are temporary workers who are sponsored by a specific employer, and they are required to leave the country if they are fired, if they become unemployed and their job disappears, or, of course, at the end of their 1 to 2 year contract. Out you go. Tens of thousands, South Asians, Filipino men and women, enter and leave the UAE every year. A few run away from their employers and become undocumented. And temporary dips in the global oil economy have led actually to massive layoffs that have resulted in the deportation. In 1 year, for example, 300,000 workers deported in 1 year. And I've painted a grim portrait here just to suggest, I think rightly, that the United Arab Emirates is unlikely to become a nation of immigrants anytime soon. But having painted this grim portrait, let me remind you that it was in Europe and in North America and not in the oil-rich countries of the Middle East that these programs for circulating labor, which are sometimes called guest worker programs, using the German term Gastarbeiter, it was there that this system for rotating labor was invented, providing, workforce without having to accept immigrants or refugees. Now, it was, I think, actually in Switzerland, a country of about 8 million, that this type of short-term employment was developed and perfected. It was in Switzerland that, since the 1960s, actually extended the system well beyond the agricultural and industrial workers who had been recruited already in the 19th century as so-called saisonniers, or seasonal workers, to other kinds of workers. And I'm sorry, I didn't put my own, we got the wrong, we got the right one. Switzerland knows that it has a long history of immigration. In 1900 already, 15% of its population had come from elsewhere. That was absolutely equivalent to Canada and the US at that time. Today, LOCBs are 29% of Switzerland's population. So but they are almost all on short-term, relatively short-term contracts. So Switzerland is actually a lot more like the UAE than it is like Canada or Australia or the United States, despite the fact that it has a democratic system of governance, right? It's a direct democracy. People there vote on every piece of legislation that's proposed every year. Every Swiss citizen votes on numerous laws. It is more like the UAE, despite the fact that, like Canada, it's a multilingual and multicultural society that has a pretty good history, at least since the 18th century, of tolerating religious differences, at least within Christianity. So many things would suggest, oh, you know, Switzerland should be a lot like Canada or the US. It should be a nation of immigrants. But actually, in its LOCB population, it's much more like the UAE. There is no birthright citizenship in Switzerland. And there is naturalization, but you know how you naturalize in Switzerland? Until very recently, your neighbors, all of them, voted on your application. Needless to say, Switzerland's rate of naturalization has been very low. Over the years, as Switzerland's economy shifted from an industrial and agricultural one to a service-oriented, high-tech, international business one, they simply extended the system of short-term work contracts to very high-end workers. I could show you my residency permit there if you wanted to see it, but I would have had to dig into my old passports to get it together. Oddly enough, the short-term professional workers in Switzerland are Germans, Austrians, Italian, and French. They speak the same languages as the Swiss. They are their immediate neighbors. They are almost all Catholics or Protestants. And yet every year, this is what happens in referenda in Switzerland. The foreigner is represented more often as a Muslim and a refugee, but the laws are intended to guarantee that the German, the Austrians, the Italians, and the French leave again. And I think you get a sense of the passion with which these debates go on in, of course, 4 different languages: French, Italian, German, and Greco-Romanish, which is a very small Romance language. In any case, Switzerland has always been quite clear. It has no interest whatsoever in becoming a nation of immigrants. And now we get to my 5th case, which appeared nowhere on the table that I showed you earlier because its proportion of LOCBs at the moment are very small, although their numbers are not so small. This is the case of China. It's the largest country in the world. Its LOCBs make up a very small proportion of that large population. And yet, I include China in every talk that I give about nations of immigrants because this country's so-called floating population of rural Chinese migrating to China's large, huge assembly industrial cities, it constitutes the largest migration in the world today. It's much larger than 240 million. In fact, of China's 3.4 billion population, 20% have moved from the countryside to the city. Now, social scientists predict, rightly, I think, that the number of rural migrants in China will diminish in the decade ahead, largely as a consequence of its one-child policy, which was only recently rescinded. And everyone who studies China expects migrants, international migrants now, foreigners, so to speak, to replace those internal rural to urban migrants as China's future workforce. Now, many of you may already know of the many similarities between China's internal migrants and the guest workers in places like the UAE or Switzerland. Under China's Yaokao registration system, rural migrants to Chinese cities could not, until last year, change their official residence. They always remained residents of the village where they were born. And as a result of that, they were unable to claim rights to urban housing in the cities where they worked, to health care in the cities where they worked, or to schooling for their children. They raise their children, they leave them in the countryside, in their native villages, because that's where the kids can get health care, housing, and they're usually raised by their grandparents, the parents working in the large kind of East Coast cities of China, visit them once a year. And if you've never seen this film, A Last Train Home, it portrays the annual migration of parents home to visit their children. Now, the long-term consequences of China's one-child policy means these migrations are likely to come to an end soon. And unless China's economic development ends soon, which no one predicts, China is going to need workers from outside. Currently, it hopes to draw back the 33 million overseas Chinese come home again. But those 33 million Chinese who have been living and working outside of China are probably not going to be attracted to the kinds of jobs that the rural migrants have been doing for the last 20 to 30 years. Thus, as you know, these images over here also already show you, these are both from Guangzhou in the southern province of Guangdong. There's already hundreds of thousands of foreigners living in the coastal cities, many of them from Africa. Why from Africa? Because that is where China is investing, that is where China is building infrastructure, that is where China is doing business and trade. And as an historian of migration, I can tell you wherever there's trade investment, there's always migration in the opposite direction. Almost always. I can't think of a single exception. Furthermore, because of China's preference for sons under the one-child policy, China's youngish population has become very heavily male-dominated, right? There's way more men in their 30s and 40s than there are women. And where do they go to find brides? They go elsewhere, especially to Southeast Asia. So it's quite possible that the number of LOCBs in China is going to increase. But as it does, do you think China will become or begin to consider itself a nation of immigrants? It seems unlikely. Like most countries in Asia, China grants citizenship on the basis of blood rather than on residency or where you're born, right? The reason they refer to Chinese overseas is because those Chinese overseas can and do hold on to their Chinese nationality. China does allow for naturalization, but as in the UAE, if you're on a short-term contract or if you're living illegally, which is the case for some of those Africans, you have no hope of ever naturalizing. It seems unlikely that China will become a nation of immigrants. It seems far more likely that China will increasingly implement the kinds of work systems that we see in the UAE and in Switzerland, where the foreigners come, they work, they remain foreigners, and they go home. And if they don't go home and they reproduce their foreignness because their children are foreigners too. So about 20 years ago, a Swiss sociology professor who had German and Polish parents actually invented a great term for Switzerland and for other countries, of which there are many, like Switzerland. He called Switzerland, I love this, a non-immigration immigration land. And I think that term nicely describes many of the countries that I have been describing for you here. The label non-immigration immigration land calls attention to the factors that distinguish these nations from the nations of immigrants like the US, Canada, or Australia. In fact, we might even say that the non-immigration immigration lands feel comfortable tolerating proportions of LOCBs that are much higher than the nations of immigrants, precisely because they know they'll be gone soon, right? Or they'll be replaced by others who will then circulate out in turn. In this slide, I'm just using various identity cards to point to the mechanisms that so many countries of the world have developed to guarantee that foreigners remain foreigners. What we see there on the left is an employment contract permit for living and working in the United Arab Emirates. On the upper right, you'll see an identity card that says this is a refugee living in a UN camp, issued by the UN High Commissioner on Human Rights. In the center, you see a Swiss residency card for a woman who is married to a worker, a professional worker from Germany. She's allowed to live 1 year. She's a family member, and she would be allowed to work if she could find a job that would take her for only 1 year. This is a short-term permission to live in Switzerland, a so-called L permit. And in the very bottom corner, it may not be visible, but this is a young baby in China who's gripping his Yaokao, his registration card that allows him to get an education in the town where he was born, but nowhere else. It's not just identity cards that separate the nations of immigrants from the non-immigration immigration lands. Equally striking and powerful, from my point of view, is what I call terminologies of mobility. Words really do matter. It really does matter whether we call people immigrants, refugees, or foreigners. And what I try to show you here is that if you are not called an immigrant, an Einwanderer, Immigrati, Ansiedler, these are terms for immigrants, but if you're called instead a foreigner, a foreigner, a foreigner, a foreigner, a foreigner, you are going to remain a foreigner. And the regulatory systems of the state have been set up to guarantee that that is the case. The words matter. So I've circled here the terms that mean foreigner, and you'll notice there's quite a lot of them. So this quick excursion through the possible nations of immigrants of the world, I think, leads to one obvious conclusion, and it's an important one. It is not demography. It is not the absolute or relative numbers of foreigners or immigrants in a country's population that determines whether or not it imagines itself and becomes a nation of immigrants, that small little cluster of countries in today's world. Nations of immigrants, as well as the non-immigration immigration lands, are products of historical nation building. And political scientists, theorists of all kinds, have offered dozens of perspectives on how nation building occurs. How is a nation built? Who's in it? Who's outside of it? I'll just point to a couple of insights that have been useful for me when I think about the nations of immigrants and the non-immigration immigration lands. Benedict Anderson's, for example, theory that nation building requires an imagination. It requires an imagination of a national community. And those imagined communities always distinguish between outsiders and insiders, but only a few of them, the nations of immigrants, actually anticipate and expect and allow outsiders through some mysterious process to become insiders. Whether in countries like Switzerland or in countries like Canada and the United States, nation building is ongoing. It's not like Canada, built itself in 1867 and it's the same place now and the same nation now that it was back then. We can say the same thing about the United States. Nation building is ongoing. It is what one theorist called a daily plebiscite or vote made by individuals who say, oh yeah, that's my nation. That's not my nation. And here's where I stand in the world. The best summary of nation building as an ongoing process that I've ever found is the theorist who said, nation building is never a done deal. It's never a done deal. The outcome is always up for grabs. And I want to end with that assertion because I want to now return very quickly in about 10 minutes or so to the two countries that have historically defined themselves as nation of immigrants and ask, so what's ahead for them? And those examples are going to come from the United States and then from Canada. The violent and upsetting and passionate debates ongoing over immigration, migration, refugees, and asylum seeking in the United States are an especially powerful reminder that the building of the American nation is not a done deal. It's going on as we watch with horror or with sympathies from here to the north. The United States can redefine itself as a nation. It can call itself a nation of immigrants in the 21st century. It can decide that no, it would rather be a non-immigration immigration land. It can call itself something else entirely. You don't have to dig deep into the pictorial archive of recent debates to know that the nation of immigrants is in play right now. Its future is not at all settled. And in thinking about these debates, which aren't new, they've occurred regularly throughout US history, it's really important to imagine, and I wish I could show you this a bit larger, the United States has not always imagined itself as a nation of immigrants. This is 1878. This is about 1960. This is 15 years ago. And if you see this, the term nation of immigrants in the United States is almost never used before the years after 1960. That's when it becomes popular. And if people in the US now can forget that it was once new, I assure you, the people in the United States could 100 years from now have forgotten that the US ever considered itself to be a nation of immigrants. Perfectly possible. And in fact, there is a rising, a still small pile of evidence that the United States might, at this very moment, be reimagining itself as a non-immigration immigration land. Just a few indicators that I chose, not quite at random. First of all, the US, like most other nations of the world, is increasingly embracing the use of short-term work visas to allow temporary residency in its country for both low and high skill workers. I mean, there it is, right there. Type of visa, non-immigrant. Non-immigrant. Okay, there's more and more and more of those workers. And the idea that everyone who comes in should be on a short-term contract I've heard it. I've heard that argument made in the US. Second, I assume I don't need to say anything about President Trump's promises to build a wall to stop Mexican migration, his executive orders trying to block refugees, exclude tourists, reduce the number of refugees admitted. Calls for the end of birthright citizenship haven't been particularly prominent in the debates of the last year, but they were very prominent in debates 5 years ago. And it wouldn't surprise me to see them reappear again in public discourse. Finally, if I could blow this one up, we do see evidence that the terminologies for mobile people are changing in the US. And this just tracks, this is what's called a Google Ngram, and it tracks the use of the terms undocumented immigrants, illegal aliens, and illegal immigrants. And what you see is a blip here in the 40s, and then after, this is 1970, you see explosion of the uses of these new words. Not immigrants, always illegal aliens, undocumented immigrants, and illegal immigrants. So the terminologies haven't driven the older terms immigrant or refugee off the map, but they certainly have increased in rapidly in recent years. And so that leaves us with the final round of questions. If the United States decides, maybe it's going to decide it's not a nation of immigrants anymore, maybe Canada will position itself to the world and represent itself to the world as the new model of an inclusionary nation of immigrants. Now, since I moved to Canada 3 years ago, I've been thinking a lot about that possibility. Now, of course, Canada is only the 10th the size of the United States, and its position in global politics is a different one because of its size and its history. However, its point system is generally admired around the world, even though I want to tell you almost no one understands here or anywhere else how that point system works. 22% of Canada's citizens residents are currently LOCBs, and in Toronto, of course, it's more than half, right? We are a migrant majority city here, and boy, do we know that at UTSC. We see it and hear it in every classroom. Canada has birthright citizenship, and it actually has naturalization procedures which are taken advantage of more often by its immigrants than is the case in the US. You can, and immigrants to Canada do become citizens at a higher rate than in the US, and they do it earlier in their career, whereas in the US, immigrants often wait 20 to 30 years before they make the change. At least since the formation of the Trudeau government, we can point to numerous signs that Canada is quite eager to present itself to the world as the model nation of immigrants. There on the left, you see Immigration Nation. This is from the Canadian Immigration and Citizenship website. Colorful, diverse, multicultural country, especially since Trump's election. Furthermore, Trudeau seems to really relish presenting Canada as a model that celebrates multiculturalism, that tolerates diversity, and that does not tolerate hate speech. And I scarcely need to remind you that thousands of small informal groups of Canadians recently welcomed 15,000 refugees from Syria in 2016 with promises to sponsor more. But in Canada, too, nation building is never a done deal. Trudeau's predecessor, Stephen Harper, was, actually fairly explicit about wanting only highly skilled young STEM immigrants, and I got caught up in that. He proposed at one point, although I'm not sure successfully implemented, a change in the oath of loyalty that immigrants take, where they had to swear loyalty to Western civilization. Although I was at a citizenship ceremony here at UTSC in August, and I don't believe that is part of the loyalty oath now. So, there's some interesting things happening here, but Canada's sense of itself as a nation, too, is a very much in flux. By the way, that's my temporary work permit, about which Bill Goff heard a lot during my year, because I didn't have sufficient points to qualify. I entered on a so-called NAFTA visa, and Harper, in his final years of office, or final months of office, decided he wasn't taking any more of those. And it took me a change of government and a change in the Immigration and Citizenship Agency to finally accumulate, and that was after 2.5 years. That despite being a tenured professor at the University of Toronto. I was not good enough, and I remember that. In any case, it's important to keep in mind that Canada is also faced with questions about the future and with opportunities to remain the same or to change. For those of you who think that Canada has an open door, I suggest you look at this figure. This is the percentage of the Canadian population admitted as immigrants every year from 1880 to 2010. In 1910, in the years around 1910, Canada admitted up to 5% of its own population every year as immigrants. For the last 30 years, with a couple of exceptions, it's remained below 1%. So Canada is relatively open, certainly when compared to the UAE, to Switzerland, or even to the United States, but it is much more closed than it was in the past, and it could become more closed in the future too. I'll remind you that historically Canada has tended actually to follow the precedent of the US in immigration policy. When the US shut the door against the Chinese, ultimately so did Canada, although it and the other colonies of the British Empire used slightly different and slightly less blatantly racist ways of accomplishing the goal. There's also one big impediment to Canada's celebration of itself as a nation of immigrants, and that is its efforts recently to find a peaceful resolution to its long troubled and generally hostile relationship to its Indigenous peoples. It's hard to celebrate immigrants as settlers in the making of Canada when you have a history of hostility and the use of those settlers in that hostility towards the Indigenous. I don't think it's likely that Canada is going to implode the way the Soviet Union did in 1989, but the case of Kazakhstan, where sedentary people became foreigners, is illustrative of how difficult it is to imagine a nation that includes everyone in places where histories of indigeneity and empire building and immigration are inseparable from each other. It's not easy. I'm not predicting that Canada will be like Kazakhstan, but the celebration of immigration to Canada now coexists in a very troubled and complicated dialogue with a discussion about the history of the marginalization and of Canada's Indigenous people. So, as an historian, I don't predict the future. I don't even want to try. My goal has simply been to encourage you to think about the American and the Canadian nations of immigrants in new ways by putting them in this larger global context, and to remind you that in Canada, as in the UAE, as in the United States, the future of the nation is always up for grabs. It's always in process. It's never a done deal. The future of Canada is not a done deal, and each and every one of you, at least for the remainder of your lives as Canadian citizens, will have a role to play in determining what kind of Canada wants to be. And that is, I hope, the most important takeaway from my lecture, and it means that it's now finally time to start a dialogue about these very important issues. I certainly am looking forward to that, and thank you for your patience.
Thank you very much, Donna. Dr. Gabaccia has agreed to stay for a question and answer session. For those that have needs, there's still food for us. There's washrooms over there if you can quietly apart, but we found last year having a question and answer right after the lecture probably was best. So I opened up to you to ask questions.
Or make comments, or raise reservations.
Start the dialogue if you want to start. Go ahead.
When I was in...
Oops. I'm sorry, I'm going to recognize her first, and then you're next in the queue. Where is it right now? I wish I were enough of an expert on Canadian immigration to give you the details. Canada has had the equivalent of short-term work or seasonal work contracts since at least the period of World War II. Most of the people from the Caribbean who came in post-World War II were on, initially at least, on short-term contracts. Canada, however, is more like Germany than Switzerland in that very quickly, if someone comes in on more than 1 or 2 years, they do allow a process called family reunification or family unification. And Switzerland objected for years to having the temporary worker bring a wife or a child. Germany, largely because of the much tougher voice and presence of Germans' trade unions, always insisted that family unification be possible, and it is possible. Canada, however, does issue lots of short-term work contracts to agricultural workers still, but also increasingly to people like me, right? I have a 3-year work contract, right? And it offers those, especially as it seeks to compete in the high-tech industry.
Isn't it always also offering people working at Tim Hortons?
That I don't know about. I've heard about this famous case and whether, yeah, I just don't know enough about the Tim Horton case to comment on it extensively. I know about it because my students have raised it with me too. Okay, sir.
When I was a youth, the world population, as I recall, was either 2 or 3 billion.
It's about, what, 10 now, I think. Something like that.
16 years ago.
Yeah.
It is now 7.5,
Yeah.
or give or take.
Yeah.
How does this explosion of the human population play into what you are talking about?
Oh, I love demography. I just wrote a book with a demographer. I actually love to talk the numbers. So I'm an historian, right? And the historians have tried to estimate the proportion of the world's population that was LOCB in 1800, in 1910, and more recently. And you know, it's always been about 3 to 4% in all of our calculations. So it's certainly true that 3.5% of 7 billion is a lot more than 3.5% of 1 billion or 800 million, right? So this is where you have to make decisions as a statistician. What makes the most sense to you as a measure that allows us to compare past and present? Is it absolute numbers, in which case, no doubt about it, there's a lot more mobile people in today's world than there were 15 years ago, 100 years ago, 250 years ago. But the proportion of the world that's been mobile has been pretty stable at 3 to 4% over at least 3 centuries. I tend to prefer looking at what I call the demographic impact in the form of a percentage rather than the absolute numbers. But that's my choice. There's no doubt that there are many, many more people, mobile people in today's world. Let me give you just one more number, because it's available. The UN actually did a multi-country study about 5 or 6 years ago, and it asked a representative sample of, I forget, 50 nations, I think, worldwide, how many of them would like to or consider moving somewhere else. And on that basis, they said 15% of the world's population would like to move to another country. But currently, it's only 3% that have been able to achieve that goal. Make of that what you will, but I think it's an interesting way of using what's called big data to kind of try to understand. What I always said to students in the United States, but I guess I could say it here too, whatever you might think, the entire world does not want to move to Canada. The entire world does not want to move to the United States. Maybe 15% does. And so far, our regulatory systems have guaranteed that only about, well, in Canada, that would be 20%. Okay, yes, in the back.
When you call Canada a country of immigration, land of immigration, would it not perhaps be more accurate to say that we have 3 cities of immigration and a country of nothing? Because how many immigrants are running to Moose Jaw? And how many are going to Lively in Northern Ontario? They're coming to Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver. So I question it as a country as opposed to 3 cities.
Yeah, and that's why I'm not willing to rule out the possibility that Canada could have exactly the kinds of probably more gently voiced discussions that are going on in the United States. Because what you said about Canada is equally true of the US. In the world today, so-called global cities attract the largest proportion of the mobile. And that's true in Canada, that's true in the UK, that's true it's true everywhere. Migrants migrate towards cities because that's where economic opportunity is perceived to be. Now, that does not mean that the rest of the countries are completely devoid of either people or of immigrants. In a country like Canada, however, that shift of migration towards the cities represents a bigger change that it may have than in a country like Germany, where, you know, Poles and Italians and other migrants were going to cities 100, 150 years ago. In Canada, 100, 150 years ago, most of those migrants were still populating the West. And of course, that's part of the settler colonization that pushes, from the perspective of Indigenous peoples, pushes Indigenous peoples towards the margin. But so for Canada, the shift from rural settlement to urban settlement is still, you know, that's a 50-year pattern. And it's a reversal of a pattern that was quite important, I think, in kind of shaping Canada's view of itself as a place that can absorb thousands, and indeed even millions. Now, what the political significance of that is, I don't know, but structurally it does create the, at least, possibility of the kind of debate between the rural parts of Canada, which don't see very many immigrants or refugees, and the urban parts. And that, I think you know, has been absolutely the structural foundation for the debates going on in the United States right now. Vast expanses of the US are, I would say, xenophobic, in part because they never actually confront immigrants, and urban dwellers tend to be pro-immigration and quite enthusiastic about the United States continuing as a nation of immigrants. That could happen in Canada, I believe, but I don't know that it will. That's up to you. I'm not a citizen yet. Let's see, there was another hand here. Somewhere? Yes, ma'am.
Well, I really like your presentations, and I like how you add, like, some of the things that you write, it really add, like, a personal touch to it, like your own.
Oh, my, you know, my pinky purple scribbles? That's to try to remind you you're not in the classroom, although I do that in the classroom.
How do you think that the factors, like, the pursuit of higher education, like university or post-secondary education,
Sure.
may affect, like, immigration, or might affect, like, mobility, people mobility?
Yeah, so actually international students are counted as LOCBs if they're captured at the moment of the census.
Oh, okay.
Right, they are. Whether or not they actually had the opportunity to become immigrants is not clear, right? We saw LOCBs are like everybody. They're refugees, they're people on short-term contracts, they're international students, and they're what we properly think of as immigrants intending to settle and to remain. So they're in those numbers. Their numbers have increased internationally quite rapidly over the last 50 years, although not nearly as rapidly as the number of tourists, right? And if a tourist happens to be around, they're usually excluded from most censuses. But if you live for a year or more as an international student, you're in that number. Countries have begun to think about what the long-term status of international students would be. It's very clearly the case, for example, that China very much wants the student citizens abroad to return again. That's part of their strategy of dealing with workforce planning into the future as the rural-urban migrations diminish in importance. Similarly, some of the major industries of Canada, and especially the United States and of Western European countries, would like to create a more transparent and predictable way for international students to change their status to that of immigrant or three-year contract worker, someone who has a longer-term possibility. The way it currently works in the US, I'm less familiar with how that works in Canada, is if you find a job as an international student with a US corporation at the top end in your profession, your employer, like my employer for that matter, will pay your immigration lawyer, and he will find, or she will find you a way to shift your status. I hate to think how much the University of Toronto paid to get me to the point where I got permanent residency, and I was not alone in this cluster of people who kind of got caught in administrative immigration changes. But even that argument that, hey, we've got English or French speaking people who've been educated in this country who are trained to move right into the, the parts of our economy that are growing, even those kinds of arguments in the US fall on deaf ears in rural communities that feel like they're in decline, they're losing people. They don't see the advantage of a transition from international student to immigrant status. So that too is very much up in the air in many countries around the world right now. And let me tell you, I was just in the UK last weekend. International students and international faculty in the UK are deeply worried about the consequences of the Brexit for them.
I just had a couple of thoughts listening to you. That one other feature of all of the countries here identify themselves as nations of immigrants is their geography, in that they were in a position, if we take aside the issue of Indigenous peoples first, to contemplate the notion of immigration and make an intentional decision about it because they're surrounded by oceans. So it is a lot more difficult for people to move. And I think in Canada we see that with the US and its reaction to Mexico. And then Canada had this reaction to Haitian immigrants coming across from the US border. But that border has never been that kind of a discussion for Canada the way it has been for other countries. And also that I do believe in the last 3 years or something, the temporary foreign worker class has exceeded the number of economic migrants in terms of numbers.
Oh, in Canada. Oh, thank you for that. That I didn't know.
Yeah.
I've put that away. Next time I get asked that question.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Well, and I thought it was interesting though that the notion of the historical piece of settling in rural areas, where a lot of those temporary foreign workers, at least in Ontario, are in rural areas.
Yeah, they're in Niagara.
Working in Niagara, but have no real pathway to citizenship. And the only temporary foreign worker pathway to citizenship is the caregiver class.
Interesting.
And that for a while was held up as a model, but it was, if they could make it more permanent, because I think in the world it was one of the only temporary foreign worker visa classes that had a prescribed pathway to citizenship, so had a way that everybody could see,
Right.
as opposed to trying to apply them through points.
Right, and even under, I mean, you begin to sense, I don't know how many of you have gone through an immigration process, either in Canada or elsewhere, but you begin to sense what an amazingly granular system most countries have created. They rest on very fine details, like some of the ones you obviously know far better for Canada than I do. And what I like to say in classes where I look at the longer histories of movements across borders is that in 1900, you could either walk or float into Ellis Island with no paper in your pocket, except a couple of dollars that showed you had enough to not starve in your first days. I myself have accumulated this much paper in migrating to Canada. And those papers are required by these very carefully and finely created policies, many of them based on, national law, that just, it's very difficult to move. And I've always wondered if the granularity of our policies doesn't explain that graph that I showed you a minute ago. This drop in the percentage of the population that comes into Canada every year. The observation about being surrounded by water as opposed to by land, that works for Argentina, it works for New Zealand, it works for Australia, it works for Canada, it works for the US, and there's certainly something at play there. The land border is a more complicated border to regulate and to surveil and to control. But countries like France, most of their immigrants, and they've had up to, I think, 25% of their population has been what we would today call LOCBs, or immigrants, or they consider them to be immigrants. France and Switzerland is completely surrounded by land borders, and it's found some pretty effective ways of knowing who those LOCBs are by making those land borders very tightly regulated and surveilled. So it's not impossible, it's just a lot more expensive to control land borders. I think you were first, and that would be a second one for you, right? I'm gonna let, and you want it on?
Sure.
Okay, so, sir?
Yeah, is the term I'm familiar with is displaced persons,
Yes?
and I'm just wondering if that's just fallen out of use, or?
No, it hasn't fallen out of use. Displaced persons is a category created by the UN for people who are displaced within their own countries, right? So if there's a civil war going on in your country, or if you are living in Colombia and the drug lords have taken over your part of the country, you become internally displaced, right? A displaced person. Now that language, internally displaced and displaced, it's a complicated one, because in the years after World War II, displaced people were refugees, right? And refugees had either crossed a border or the border had crossed them. So the distinction that I like to make usually now is there are refugees who flee, and these are UN definitions. There are refugees who go to a camp run by the UN because they're afraid of particular kinds of persecution in the place where they lived, right? They're refugees. Asylum seekers are people who say, I'll head out on my own, thank you very much. I'll show up at a border somewhere and hope that they'll take me, right? These are people who don't, they don't have one of those UN cards. In the past, both of these groups were considered displaced peoples. Displaced peoples now usually refers to internal, IDPs as they're called, internally displaced people. But the UN does have a convention that acknowledges that not everyone who flees to a refugee camp or flees on their own are running away from political or religious persecution. Maybe a volcano went off in your hometown, right? They're regarded as displaced people still.
Yeah, because my parents came to Canada as displaced persons.
From Latvia, maybe?
Originally from Poland, but from England, owned by way of England.
Yeah. And refugees, displaced peoples, and asylum seekers all often have much more complicated journeys because seeking asylum or seeking a place of refuge can push you in many directions. I don't know how many of you have met Somali Canadians who spent time in Russia, but there's a number of them. So the paths of people who are forced as opposed to people who choose more voluntarily to move are often very, very complicated. Yeah, okay. Was it you?
Me?
Yeah, you. And then you, and then you in the green shirt. Yes, one.
Okay, well, it's awfully nice that you were able to get into the country so we could hear from you today.
Yeah.
Thank the government for that. Your presentation was certainly enlightening, and I was writing down so many questions I wanted to ask, but I'll just
Choose one.
Just one, yeah. But a lot of them have been answered already. I got a chuckle when someone said, who would go live up in Lively? Well, that's a suburb of Sudbury, and I got transferred up there back in the 80s, so I got to know Lively and their golf courses up there. But the question or inquiry I have is that the US of A, under the current president, understand has put restrictions of people coming from certain countries into the country.
He's tried 3 times now.
Yeah. I'm not certain whether this would be something that may occur in Canada. It has happened in the past, as we know.
Yes, it has.
But whether it'll be something more centralized in the future from people from particular types of countries or background And I'm only suggesting this, and not in a negative way, but just the way the newspapers have been reporting it. There seems to be an element of referrals to terrorist type groups and the rest of that. So I'm just wondering what kind of impact that might have on the countries. I know that, perhaps, like the States now, maybe Canada, the situations in England, France.
Wow, this is such a huge question. What can I say with any kind of certainty? So first of all, it is said, and even historians who look at the histories of immigration restrictions worldwide sort of joke and say that when the United States catches the cold of immigration restriction, Canada and Australia sneeze, South Africa. I mean, all of these countries are very aware of what the others are doing, and that's part of their international, relations, strategies, right? So that's one of the reasons that I don't rule out the possibility that something similar could happen in Canada, because historically I know it has. When the Chinese got excluded from the US, the US diplomats started talking to everybody, including to Canada's and Britain's governments, and there were changes in policies throughout the Americas and indeed throughout the world to exclude the so-called yellow peril, as it was called in those days. Would it happen in the same way in Canada as in the United States? I rather doubt that, because again, historically, Canada found ways to exclude the Chinese, which didn't say we don't want yellow people, which is essentially what the US policies said. Canada did not use the word, the language of racial exclusion. It used head taxes. Australia used dictation tests that would be given, you had to be able to take a dictation in a modern language, and so they would give an Egyptian immigrant their dictation in some language they knew they didn't understand and make them excludable. So there's ways to be gentle racists as well as blatant racists, and Canada has a pretty good history on gentle, although from the perspective of the Chinese body, it's not so gentle. But you take my point. The other thing that strikes me is that, I'm not a Canadian citizen, so I try not to engage in obviously political judgments here yet. But I have heard my Canadian citizen friends say that, Trump came in just as Harper was going out, right? And in Canada, it was rather the reverse. The kind of conservative, economically nationalist and Western civilizational fears of Islam and multiculturalism played itself out in Canada earlier. I guess that's the way I would put it. But that populist nationalism, or some people call it white nationalism, or call it what you will, that exists in many countries around the world that increasingly perceive the world and the migrants who travel as threats, not as contributions to nation building. You've seen that in the recent German election. You saw that in different ways in the French election. They've had different outcomes, but there is a generalized sense that the countries that have accepted about 50% of the world's migrants over the last 30 to 40 years, the natives of those countries, if you can use such a term, are uneasy. Whether or not Trump actually succeeds in his constant efforts to exclude people from Muslim majority countries because of the fear of terrorism is still an unsettled matter. Every one of his executive orders in the last now 10 months have been challenged through the court system, and he hasn't done well in that process. Nevertheless, the folks who support Trump, these are not evidence-based voters usually. They are not swayed by the overwhelming evidence that death by terrorists is usually not death by a foreigner in the United States. My God, look what happened yesterday. This was not a foreigner, not a Muslim. But he still had a huge cache of weapons, and he still killed a lot of people. But again, for many economic nationalists, and especially for many nationalists who perceive the outside as threatening, political decisions are not always made on the basis of evidence. They're made on what my Italian grandmother would say, their liver, their heart, or their stomach, right? Not their head. So it's in your hands, folks, what the future will be. Now there was, let's see, you, and then you. Okay, so, yes, ma'am.
Taken a little bit by your discussion of the extended paperwork that you have been involved in.
Oh, it's every migrant in the world.
Well, but it's possible applicability to the drop that you show on the graph as time goes on. My experience with immigration was 23 years ago when I sponsored my daughter as a family class immigrant.
Oh, yeah.
I filled out one piece of paper and had to have $17,000 a year income in order to support.
Yeah, that was it.
Which is pathetic.
Yeah.
I couldn't support myself on $17,000. So I'm wondering whether I'm correct in assuming that a large part of your immigration right now is family reunification, which I found frighteningly easy to do, or whether the I'm assuming, and please don't take this the wrong way, work-based immigration is harder than family.
It is.
But I found, like I said, it was one piece of paper. That's all I had to do.
And that's what I meant when I said that Canada's point system is well admired around the world, but most people don't understand how it works. And they assume that a point-based system means that it's largely economic. I usually call them labor migrants enter Canada. Your experience was exactly comparable to what happened in my house. My partner and I both entered Canada around the same time. We both filed but his dad happened to have been in Canada, and he got his permanent residency instantaneously. My colleague Audrey Macklin downtown has showed pretty conclusively that 2/3 of all recent arrivals in Canada arrived through family unification procedures and not through the point system, in fact. Now, I leave it to you to sort that out. 2/3 of the people who enter the US also enter in exactly the same way. 2/3 of the people who become immigrants in, 2/3 of the people who become immigrants in the Netherlands, exactly the same. Most countries of the world, at least the large ones that absorb 50%, most of them actually privilege family relationships, or as my colleagues in gender and women's studies would say, they favor reproductive heteronormative people, right? They want young people, and I'm not young, they want reproducing people, and they want reproducing people who are reproducing in straight families, right? Man, woman, baby, new Canadian, right? I'm being a little bit cynical and silly here, but the point system distracts us from the fact that in your experience, my experience with that are one and the same. Yeah, Jeffrey had to put together more papers than you did. But as soon as the lawyer discovered that he had a Canadian dad who hadn't lived in Canada since he was 10 years old, doesn't matter, said, gee, you could probably go straight for Canadian citizenship if you wanted. That made me feel really good. Anyway. Yes, sir.
I've been reading in the newspapers about Japan's Asian population and the need for younger workforce, and that they've lost a lot in their birth rates.
Oh, they have.
And I'm wondering about the comparisons between Japan, an isolated island state, and Canada, where we have the Americans to the south, but our immigration do you see it going up because our population is aging and our birth rate is falling?
Sure. Most of the people who studied both Japan and Western Europe make this point. In neither Japan has not been replacing itself from its population for quite some time. Most of the countries of at least Southern and Western Europe are now in the same boat. If you don't reproduce yourself, you're going to start shrinking. Maybe that's a good thing. I'll leave it to my folks in environmental studies to sort that one out. But most modern nations don't think that a declining population is a good thing. You populate in order to govern, right? Literally. Japan did experiment about 20 to 30 years ago by opening its doors to people of Japanese descent, many of whom came to Japan from Brazil. You may know about this. It was an experiment that quickly failed, and I had a wonderful anthropology colleague, a Japanese origin anthropologist, who did a beautiful imitation of why it failed, and he kind of imitated the body language of native, people who had been born and raised in Japan, and then he did the Brazilian thing, right? Now that's a silly example, but most of those Japanese Brazilians subsequently left with governmental encouragement and support and returned to Brazil. Japan has been fairly adamant. It's a bit like Switzerland. So what I would actually expect if I were someone who predicted as opposed to an historian, if I were a predictor, I would actually predict that Japan would eventually adopt the model of Switzerland. But that's just a guess. You want a workforce? It's either going to have to come from bearing and nurturing up the babies born on your own soil, or it's going to come from outside. And there's plenty of models around the world today of countries who get the labor that they want without having to admit a single immigrant or refugee. The UAA does not admit either immigrants or refugees, just guest
So the
workers.
follow-up to Canada would be that we would need to bring in more immigrants if our birth rate is declining.
That actually, I think, depends on what the birth rates of the newest Canadians will be. Historically, immigrants arrive with fertility patterns that produce more babies on average than the native citizen. But usually, as in the case of Italian Americans, for heaven's sakes, or Mexican Americans, high fertility rates usually shift over the course of one, possibly two generations to match that of the natives. So if indeed the newest Canadians reproduce at the rate of longtime Canadians, then yeah, Canada is going to face a demographic crisis. How it will be resolved and whether it will be resolved with guest worker programs, with new ways of living that scatter more of us across the land and out of our massive cities, I don't know. One of the things as a historian is that you recognize that many of the most important changes nobody saw coming, so I don't know. But yes, the demographic challenge will be here in Canada as well. Okay, I think you're our final
Can I
questioner.
ask you two questions?
Yeah.
Anyway, I'm interested in the distinction. We hear refugees being thrown around as a term
Yes?
and immigrants.
Yes.
And I think there's a difference between the two in people's minds.
Oh yeah, there are.
And there's a difference between the impact of those two groups. Is there any, are there any statistics to say what the percentage of refugees as opposed to immigrants?
So until World War II, in places like Canada, Australia, and the United States, the word immigrant was an umbrella term because there were no special programs or regulations specifically for refugees. And in fact, until the 1920s, these countries didn't even distinguish between people who came to work, people who came to get married, people who came because they were getting kicked out of rural Russia. They just didn't distinguish. They wanted people came, they didn't bother with the categories. But after World War II, the term immigrant increasingly comes to mean an economically or a family-motivated person. And it's distinguished from the refugee who has the UN stamp, or the asylum seeker who comes asking for asylum, as the UN Declaration on Human Rights provides. Whether or not, all right, I'll stick my neck out, but this is about the US. I'm less familiar with the Canadian patterns. I personally, as an historian of the United States, do not see different demographic or economic patterns among labor migrants, family reunifiers, and refugees. But there is a vast variation in the US refugee policy, in the population, between illiterate subsistence farmers with animistic religions and often living in plural marriages, like the Hmong from Southeast Asia. Their economic outcomes in the US are decidedly different from the upper class, wealthy, English and Spanish speaking Catholics who arrive from Cuba, for example. Right? But the refugee population does incorporate both very poor people with very limited preparation for life in an economically advanced society, and lots of refugees who are frankly better educated than the average American. An immigrant woman in the United States is much more likely to have a PhD than somebody who was born and raised in the US. I'm not sure if that's true for Canada, but anybody who knows Canada better than I do, I would love to be pointed towards that indicator. So I don't see significant differences in economic outcomes. But, and certainly in the United States, and I suspect also in Canada, the perception of the refugee as somebody who takes rather than gives has been an important influence on local and national politics. And in Minnesota, which had a very large, complex and mixed refugee population, many of my students who came from refugee families didn't like to use the word refugee for themselves because they felt it had become a stigmatizing term that essentially said, oh, welfare cheat. And that in a country where, in fact, refugees are required to pay back the cost of their own transportation within 2 years. So the power of terminologies and the ever-changing nature of those terminologies of mobility matters a lot. And refugee has, in many places, become a stigmatizing term. I know in Italy, for example, where a third of the population is the descendant of returnees from Canada, the US, Argentina, et cetera, Italians like to say, oh yeah, we were migrants. I mean, we worked. These refugees, they just come here to take, right? So it's a process of stigmatization that can be identified in many different countries, and that again calls our attention to the importance not just of kind of laws and policies like birthright citizenship, naturalization, and immigration policy, but also to the very categories in which we try to pigeonhole people in order to govern them and to decide which ones may and may not enter. Anybody else?
Can I ask a personal question?
Yes.
Why did you come to Canada?
Because I got a very good job offer. I'm a labor migrant. I went to Germany because I got a good job offer. I went to Switzerland because I got a good fellowship offer. I'm a classic labor migrant, as were my father, grandfather, and great-grandfather before me. I go where there's work, I go. Here I am.
Well, on that note, we're incredibly grateful that you chose to join us.
Thank you, Bill.
It was a painful process, more so for you than me, but
He had to listen to me. I was not happy.
very forthcoming. But a huge asset to UTSC. We're grateful. Please join me in thanking you for